Before we begin, drop a comment below. Have you ever walked into a place that wasn't yours and started fixing things you had no business fixing? Because sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is care about something that doesn't belong to them yet. Let's get into it. The first thing Adaeze noticed about the house on Peachtree Glen was that it was trying very hard not to be noticed. It sat at the end of a curved Atlanta street where the other homes had fresh shutters and seasonal wreaths and the kind of manicured lawns that announced intention. This one had none of that. Its front porch held a single rocking chair no one had used in months. She could tell by the thin layer of pollen across the seat. The window boxes were there but empty. The paint on the front door, once a deep forest green, had begun to peel at the corners in a way that looked less like neglect and more like grief. Adaeze sat in her rental car at the curb for 60 seconds and studied it. She'd been hired by the estate firm to do a full interior assessment before the property went to market. 3 days, maybe 4. Catalog what was there, propose what needed to go, photograph everything for the staging brief. In and out. She'd done it 47 times in the last 6 years. Houses that held other people's lives, like old cardboard boxes. Everything slightly flattened, slightly faded, waiting for someone to decide what mattered and what didn't. She picked up her bag and walked up the front path. The door was answered before she could knock. Not by the estate agent she'd expected, but by a man who looked like he'd been interrupted in the middle of being somewhere else entirely. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in dark work clothes that had actual dust on them. He was black, maybe mid-30s, with a particular kind of tiredness around the eyes that doesn't come from one bad night, but from a long season of them. He held the door open and looked at her with an expression she immediately recognized. The controlled blankness of a person who has been keeping themselves together through sheer force of habit. "Miss Obi?" he said. His voice was low, slightly rough, Atlanta flat, with something underneath it she couldn't place yet. "Adaeze is fine." She extended her hand. "You must be the family contact." He took her hand briefly. "Marcus Cole. She was my grandmother." She was. Past tense, Adaeze absorbed that quietly. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said, and meant it the way she always meant it. Not as a formula, but as a small, honest acknowledgement that she was walking into someone else's chapter of grief. He stepped aside to let her in. The house was full of color. That was the first and most immediate thing. After the quiet, after the particular smell of old wood and dried flowers and something faintly floral that she'd trace later to a candle burned down to its last half-inch on the kitchen windowsill. Someone had lived in this house with absolute intention. The living room walls were a warm, layered saffron that deepened toward the ceiling. The kitchen had handmade tiles along the backsplash in deep teal and cream. Every room had at least one textile, a throw, a runner, a framed piece of kente cloth hung with the reverence of a painting. There were photographs everywhere, and plants. Rows of them, some green and thriving, some beginning to struggle without their keeper. Adaeze stopped in the middle of the living room and turned slowly once. She was aware that Marcus had stopped behind her, watching her take it in, and that he was bracing himself for something. The professional inventory, probably. The eyes that would tally and categorize and quietly begin the process of erasure. "She did this herself?" Adaeze asked. "Over about 30 years, yeah." Something shifted in his voice. "She always said a home should look like whoever lived in it." "It does." Adaeze looked at the kente cloth on the wall, at the row of framed photographs on the mantelpiece, at a small hand-thrown ceramic bowl on the coffee table that held a single smooth river stone and 2 dried frangipani blooms. "It absolutely does." She heard him exhale behind her, brief, barely audible, but she heard it. Her instructions from the estate firm were clear. Assess, propose, stage for market. Strip it back to something neutral, something that appealed to the broadest buyer profile. It was standard practice. She'd done it without a second thought 46 times. On the morning of day 2, she stood in the grandmother's bedroom doorway with her clipboard and her professional brain firmly in place and she looked at the quilt on the bed, hand-stitched, clearly old, clearly made with someone's hands over a long period of love, and she put the clipboard down on the dresser and just stood there. Marcus found her there 20 minutes later. He'd been in the basement going through files. The estate firm needed inventory documentation, and he'd been doing that quietly and separately, the way she'd noticed he did most things. He appeared in the doorway and looked at her, then at the quilt, then back at her. "I was trying to decide what to recommend," she said honestly, "for the staging. Whether the quilt stays. It goes with me," he said immediately. "That's not negotiable." "I wasn't going to put it in the out pile." She looked at him. I was standing here trying to figure out how to do this job in a way that doesn't feel like." She stopped. "Like erasing her?" His voice was quiet, but not harsh. "Yes." He leaned against the door frame and crossed his arms, looking at the room with the particular expression of someone who has been doing the same calculation for weeks. She wanted the house sold. That was in the will. Clear as anything. She was practical about it. "Don't let it become a museum, Marcus. Museums are for dead things." His jaw moved slightly. Those were her exact words. "She sounds like she was something," Adaeze said. "She was everything," he said simply. The word fell into the room without drama. Adaeze picked up her clipboard. "Then let's make sure whoever buys this place feels the warmth in it," she said. "Not sterile, warm. I'm not stripping out the character, I'm framing it. There's a difference." He looked at her for a moment in a way that reminded her of something she couldn't immediately name. "Okay," he said, and she understood that was not a small word from him. By day 3, she knew the following things about Marcus Cole. He was a structural engineer who had left a position at a firm in Chicago 8 months ago to come back to Atlanta when his grandmother's health declined. He hadn't gone back. He'd been here ever since, working freelance, sleeping in the guest room of the house on Peachtree Glen, keeping the plants alive, keeping the lights on, and doing the very difficult, invisible labor of being the person who holds the shape of a family together while everyone else processes from a comfortable distance. She knew this not because he told her. He was not a man who volunteered information about himself, but because she was observant, and because a house tells you things about the people who've lived in it, and a person tells you things by what they maintain and what they let go. The plants were watered. The kitchen was clean. The bills were paid. The grandmother's medication schedule was still on the refrigerator. In his handwriting, every dose marked off. He'd been doing that alone for a long time. She knew one more thing, which she was being extremely disciplined about not examining too closely. He had the most careful hands she had ever watched a person work with. She'd seen him repair a broken shelf bracket in the study. On day 2, working with the focused, unhurried precision of someone who believed that things worth fixing deserved to be fixed correctly. She'd watched without meaning to for longer than was professionally appropriate. And then looked at her notes very intently for a while. It was the Korean neighbor who changed the temperature of everything. Mrs. Han lived next door and was apparently one of the grandmother's closest friends. A compact woman in her late 60s with sharp eyes, excellent posture, and the energy of someone who had decided in her 50s that she no longer had time for anything that wasn't direct. She arrived at the front door on Thursday morning with a container of japchae and an agenda. "You're the one fixing it up," she said to Adaeze, looking her over with the calm thoroughness of someone conducting an assessment of their own. "I'm doing the staging for the market listing, yes." Mrs. Han looked past her into the house. Miriam would want it to smell like something good before it goes. The house should smell like it's alive. She held up the japchae. "Where's Marcus?" He appeared from the hallway, and something happened to his face when he saw her, a small, unguarded softening that Adaeze absorbed and carefully filed away. "Mrs. Han," he said, "you didn't have to. I always have to. Come, both of you. Eat." This was apparently not a suggestion. They sat at the grandmother's kitchen table, which Adaeze had been cataloging for the staging report, and Mrs. Han served the japchae from the container with the efficiency of a woman who had fed people through their grief before, and understood it was one of the most useful things you could do. She talked about Miriam, the grandmother, with the unsentimental affection of true long friendship, how they'd met at a community garden 22 years ago, arguing over the placement of tomato plants, how Miriam had been the kind of woman who made you better simply by requiring you to be honest in her presence, how she had raised Marcus after his parents split and his mother moved away, and had done it without complaint or performance, just with the absolute steadiness of someone who understood that love was mostly just showing up. Marcus ate and listened and said very little. Adaeze watched him. "She talked about you," Mrs. Hahn said to him suddenly, and his fork paused. "I know. She said you were the one she worried about least, because you always knew how to take care of things." She looked at him steadily, but she also said that was the thing she worried about most. The silence in the kitchen was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that happens when a true thing lands. "I'm fine," Marcus said. "You're functional," Mrs. Hahn said pleasantly. "Those are different things." She stood and picked up her container. "The japchae reheats well. Don't rush it." She looked at Adaeze with those sharp eyes. "You understand spaces," she said. "It wasn't a question." "I try to," Adaeze said. Mrs. Hahn nodded once, like something had been confirmed, and left. The afternoon after Mrs. Hahn's visit, Adaeze found the box. It was in the back of the grandmother's wardrobe, behind winter coats and shoeboxes, a medium-sized wooden box, unlocked, with Marcus's name written on the top in the grandmother's handwriting. She brought it out and set it on the bed and went immediately to find him. He was in the backyard, sitting on the back steps, looking at the garden, which still held the structure of something that had been loved. Raised beds, a small stone path, a bird bath that needed cleaning. He was very still in the way he sometimes got, and she stood at the back door for a moment before saying his name. He turned. She held up the box. Something crossed his face. "She told me there was a box," he said. I kept not being ready to look for it. I can leave it with you." "No," he said it quickly. Then, "Quiet, stay." She sat beside him on the back steps and put the box between them. He opened it slowly, with those careful hands. Inside, photographs she hadn't seen elsewhere in the house. Marcus at various ages, a woman who must have been his mother, the grandmother younger and luminous at some outdoor event. A folded letter, a small velvet-wrapped object that turned out to be a compass. Old, solid silver, with initials on the back that weren't Miriam's. A drawing in crayon, clearly by a child's hand, of a house with very large windows and the words "My house" in uneven capital letters, and below it, in adult handwriting. Marcus, age 6, he always drew the windows big so the light could get in. Marcus held the drawing for a long time. Adaeze didn't say anything. She'd learned that about him, that he needed space to arrive at things, that the things he arrived at were worth waiting for. The garden was very quiet. A bird did something in the old oak at the back of the yard. The afternoon light was the particular quality it got in Atlanta in late October, slant and warm and generous with shadows. "She kept everything," he said finally. "Yes. I used to think she was just organized, practical. She wasn't sentimental, you know. She never cried at movies, never made a big deal out of anything. She just did things." He looked at the drawing. "But she kept this. The unsentimental ones often keep the most," Adaeze said quietly, "because they're selective about what matters." He looked at her then, directly, in a way he'd been carefully not doing for 3 days, and she met it. "Where are you from?" he said, not the professional conversation version of the question. The real one. "Lagos, originally. London for school, Atlanta for the last 4 years." She paused. "You?" "Here, born and raised. Left for Chicago, came back for her." He looked at the garden. "I don't think I'm going back." She didn't ask him to explain that. She understood it in the way you understand some things. Not through logic, but through recognition. "The compass," she said after a moment. "Whose initials?" He turned it over in his hand. Her father's. He was a merchant sailor. He gave it to her when she was 12, when he left for the last time. She never saw him again. He closed his fingers around it. She told me once that she used to think the compass was broken because it never pointed her toward him. Then she figured out it was working exactly right. It was pointing her toward whatever was true north. For her. He paused. She made an entire life out of that idea. Adaeze was quiet for a moment. Then, that's the most useful inheritance I've ever heard of. He made a sound, brief, surprised, warm. The first real laugh she'd gotten out of him, and it did something to her that she was going to have to think about later. When she was alone and had the emotional bandwidth for it, that evening she stayed later than she'd planned. This was becoming a pattern she was absolutely aware of and doing nothing about. They ended up in the kitchen again. She made tea. He found biscuits his grandmother had in a tin that hadn't been opened. They sat across from each other at the table that was supposedly just a staging prop now. Mrs. Hahn had been right. The house smelled like something good. The japchae from earlier, and the candle on the windowsill she'd replaced that afternoon with one that matched the grandmother's obvious taste. Amber, slightly smoky, warm. He told her about the firm in Chicago, about the project that had made his reputation, and the promotion he'd turned down to come back. About the particular silence of driving back into Atlanta, knowing you were returning for a reason that was already almost over. About the months since, the practical grieving, the functional life, the way he'd been going through the motions of existing so efficiently that he stopped noticing he wasn't actually living. She told him about the job, the 47 houses before this one, the professional detachment that protected her, the way she'd gotten very good at not caring, and was finding it increasingly difficult to sustain. About the apartment she'd rented in Atlanta that still had bare walls because she kept telling herself she'd get to it. About her mother calling from Lagos every Sunday and always ending with, "When are you coming home?" And Adaeze never having a real answer. "You've been doing what I've been doing," he said. "Surviving as a full-time occupation," she said. Yeah, he was quiet for a moment. My grandmother would have had words. She sounds like the kind of woman who would. She'd have looked at me right now and said, he stopped. Something moved across his face. She'd have said, "Marcus, stop being so careful with yourself. The people worth having will not shatter you." The kitchen was very quiet. Was she right? Adaeze asked. She was always right, he said. That was the irritating thing. She looked at him across the table. This man who had been so careful and so present, and so quietly devastating to spend 3 days around. And she thought about the drawing in the box, the big windows so the light could get in. She thought about a compass that points toward true north for you specifically, and what it feels like when it starts to move. "The house is ready," she said. "I finished the assessment. I'll send the report tomorrow." "Okay." His voice was even, but something behind his eyes was not. "I want you to look at it before I submit it," she said. "I made some recommendations about what stays and what's framed differently, and I need you to tell me if I got it wrong. If anything feels like I misread her." He looked at her carefully. "That's not standard procedure." "No," she said, "it's not." A long pause. "What made you want to do this job?" he said. She thought about it honestly. "I grew up in a house that kept changing. Every 2 years, a new city, a new school, new walls. My mother tried to make each one feel like home quickly. She was brilliant at it, actually, faster than anyone. But I always felt like I was performing belonging rather than having it. So I went into this work because I thought, if I can give other people the feeling I was always chasing, that's worth something." She paused. "I just got so focused on giving it to strangers that I forgot to give it to myself." He was watching her with that careful, unhurried attention of his. "Come back tomorrow," he said. "Not for the job. Just—" He stopped, recalibrated. "Come back tomorrow." She came back. Not just tomorrow. The day after, and the day after that. The estate report was filed. The staging was complete. The house would go to market in 2 weeks. There was no professional reason for her to keep coming back to Peachtree Glen. She kept coming back to Peachtree Glen. They cleaned out the garden together. On a Saturday, Mrs. Han appearing and disappearing at intervals with snacks and opinions, and the air of someone whose plan was working precisely as intended. Marcus was quiet but different now, less maintained, more present. He laughed more, he pushed back more. He had a way of looking at her that made her feel like she'd been correctly understood, which was more unsettling and more wonderful than she'd expected. She brought a plant for the kitchen windowsill, not a replacement for the grandmother's. She was very clear about that. "This one is new," she said, setting it on the sill beside the candle. "It's not trying to be anything except itself." He looked at it, then at her. "You brought a plant. It's a succulent. It's very low maintenance. You've been here 9 days. Your grandmother would have liked me," she said, with a confidence she absolutely felt. He looked at her for a long moment. "She would have," he said, quiet and certain. "She would have liked you the moment you put the clipboard down." Adaeze looked at him. The kitchen was warm. The plant was on the windowsill. Outside, the Atlanta afternoon was doing its October thing, gold warm, generous, unhurried. Mrs. Han could be heard next door, apparently reorganizing something, the soundtrack of a woman who had decided to be conveniently nearby. "I haven't hung anything on my walls," she said. "My apartment. It's been 4 years and I have bare walls." "Why?" "Because I was always going to get to it. Because I kept waiting until I felt like it was really mine." He nodded slowly. "My grandmother said a space becomes yours when you stop treating it like it might reject you." "She said that?" She had a saying for everything. She would have been insufferable if she'd been wrong more often. He held her gaze. "What do you want on the walls?" She thought about it, really thought about it, for the first time, not as a decorator but as a person. "Color," she said finally. "Something warm. Not staged, just alive, like this kitchen." "Like this kitchen," she agreed. The thing that happened next was quiet and inevitable, and had been coming. Since the morning she'd stood in the grandmother's bedroom doorway with the clipboard, since he'd said she was everything. Without performance or self-pity, since the compass in the velvet cloth and the child's drawing of a house with big windows. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. That was all. He didn't say anything. She turned her hand over and held his back. Outside, Mrs. Han knocked something over and swore in Korean, then recovered herself with dignity. A bird landed on the birdbath Marcus had cleaned last week. The candle on the windowsill had found its last hour and was burning with the particular warmth of things that know they're near the end and lean into it. The house sold on a Wednesday to a young couple, a Nigerian-American architect and his Korean-American wife, which Mrs. Han declared was obviously fated, and Adaeze did not entirely disagree. They'd walked through it and fallen still in the living room the same way. Adaeze had, looking at the saffron walls and the kente cloth and the handmade tiles, and the wife had turned to the husband and said something quietly in Korean that he'd answered by squeezing her hand. And that was that. They were keeping the quilt pattern, not the quilt itself, which Marcus took. But they'd asked if they could commission something similar for the Phi bedroom. He'd given them Mrs. Han's number. Mrs. Han, it turned out, had made the original. On a Sunday in November, Adaeze's apartment had color on its walls for the first time in 4 years, not staged, not neutral, a deep, warm saffrons on the accent wall that she'd mixed herself and applied in 2 afternoons. Marcus beside her, doing the cut-in work with the focused precision she had expected and come to rely on. A photograph of her mother on the mantelpiece. A kente cloth runner across the entryway table. A small collection of things she'd gathered from the city that meant something specifically to her. A smooth river stone. A ceramic bowl from a maker's market. 2 dried flowers she'd bought from a vendor on Auburn Avenue who'd been there 30 years. And on the kitchen windowsill, the succulent thriving. Marcus stood in the middle of the room and turned slowly once. She watched him take it in, the color, the light, the accumulated evidence of someone's specific life beginning to take root. "Well?" she said. He looked at her, and then he smiled, fully, without reservation, the smile of a man who had spent a long season being careful and had decided, finally, to put it down. You were right, he said. I'm frequently right, she said. You'll get used to it. He crossed the room in 3 steps and kissed her. Not a first kiss that announced itself like a proclamation, but one that arrived like something that had been true for a while and was only now being said aloud. Warm and certain, and in no hurry to be anything except exactly what it was. When they pulled apart, she looked at him and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything. Because there was nothing that needed saying. Outside, the Atlanta evening was doing its thing. Mrs. Hahn, who had driven the 3 hours from Atlanta to visit because she had decided she was part of this story now, and no one was going to argue with her, called from the kitchen, where she'd somehow already located the kettle. "Tea is ready," she announced. "And I brought japchae. You can thank me later." Adaeze laughed. Marcus shook his head once, affectionate, helpless. He took her hand. The room held them both, warm and full and alive, exactly as it was always supposed to be. And that's where we leave Adaeze and Marcus. In an apartment on a street in Atlanta that finally knows who lives in it. With color on the walls and something in the kitchen windowsill and the absolute, unhurried certainty that the compass is pointing exactly where it should. If this story got into you, please like, share, and subscribe. It genuinely keeps us going, Nesties, and I want your thoughts in the comments. What was the moment you knew Marcus was already gone for her? Was it when he said she was everything? When he opened the box? Or when he said simply, "Come back tomorrow, and tell me this"? Have you ever stood in someone else's space and realized it was showing you something you needed to see in your own life? Drop it below. Let's talk. African Chronicles, The Warmth Between Wolves, Atlanta Love, Black Love, Romance Story. Moral story: this story is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. The compass always points true north. The rest is up to you.